And I want to thank you all for joining us today for this important webinar and call for questions on ability to benefit. We're really thrilled to have such a great response to the webinar. We have several hundred folks signed up who are going to be joining the conversation today, and we're also very excited to be co-sponsoring this webinar with our colleagues at the Center for Law and Social Policy, or CLASP, and you'll be hearing from my CLASP colleagues a little later. So to give you a sense of the structure of the webinar, after this brief introduction, we're going to talk more specifically about the reinstatement of ability to benefit. Then we'll spend some time going a little deeper into the issue of career pathways and their relation to ability to benefit. Then we'll have a panel from 3 colleagues from the field who will be talking about their work in this area. So we'll be hearing from Washington State, the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and some local officials from St. Paul College in Minnesota. And then we will end the session with questions and answers. And as you'll see on this slide, if you have questions that you'd like to ask, please email them to the address on the screen, so awaw@jff.org. And just because of the number of folks who are on the webinar, we ask that you do it via email rather than through the WebEx system. So just a little bit of background. So as you all know, as we read about in a lot of reports these days coming out from Tony Carnevale and other researchers, in today's economy and in the economy that we project for the next decade or so, industry-recognized post-secondary credentials are really necessary for securing good jobs and for economic prosperity. I think the statistic that we use a lot is that almost 2/3 of the new jobs being created are going to require some type of education or training beyond secondary. And so the elimination of ability to benefit, or as I'll call it ATB in my remarks, in 2012 has prevented many students from accessing these needed post-secondary credentials. And so it's really for that reason that we here at JFF and many of our colleagues in the field are really thrilled that last December, Congress partially restored ATB as part of the fiscal year 2015 Omnibus Appropriations Bill. And I want to thank, I know many of you were engaged in the advocacy efforts that resulted in that restoration. And so I thank you for that. And I think the reason that we really feel it's important to take this time today is to be sure that, we are really doing everything we can to fully implement these provisions and give students the access that they need to education. So a little bit of background on the new provisions. So they allow students who do not currently have a high school diploma or a GED, but who are enrolled in eligible career pathways program to be determined eligible for Pell Grants if they either pass an approved test or successfully complete 6 hours of college credit. So that term, enrollment in eligible career pathways, is one, obviously, that's critically important and one that we will spend a lot of time on this afternoon. So the Department of Education provided guidance on the use of the new ATB provisions for determining Pell Grant eligibility in May of this year. However, we know that a lot of questions have remained about the discretion given to post-secondary institutions for determining Pell eligibility under this new provision of law. So again, we really want to take the time today to get some of those questions answered and to provide clarity on what's possible under the statute and the guidance. So we're really pleased and very appreciative to have with us today 3 officials from the U.S. Department of Education to talk about the importance of the ATB provision and to provide you with further clarification on the guidance that the department issued a few months ago. And as I mentioned before, we'll also be hearing from folks from the state and local level who are going to talk about their experience in making Pell eligibility determinations using the new law and guidance. So now it's really my pleasure to introduce Mark Mitsui. Mark is a great colleague of JFF, and he is currently the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Community Colleges within the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education, or OCTE, at the U.S. Department of Education. And before joining OCTE, Mark served as the president of North Seattle Community College and also in a number of other senior roles in Washington State's community college system. So, Mark, I'm going to pass this over to you.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you to JFF and class for allowing us to participate in your webinar today. We all know how important this new provision is because we know the need. As you are well aware, there are millions of people in this country without a high school credential that are not engaged in either secondary or our post-secondary educational systems. And as you have heard, at the same time, the skill requirements for entry into the middle class have never been higher and continue to rise. According to the Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies, not only are skills related to the economic prospects of our students, but also to future health outcomes and even civic engagement. So we know that the stakes are high, and that is why the new ATP provisions are so important and represent so much potential. We're pleased that you are participating in this webinar, and we know that you share with us an interest in seeing this implemented in a manner that's not only consistent with statute, but also in a manner that benefits the largest number of people in the best possible way. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you two of my colleagues at the U.S. Department of Education. Dave Musser is a program specialist in federal student aid in the U.S. Department of Education, and Carney McCullough is the director of the Policy Development Group in the Office of Post-Secondary Education, also at the U.S. Department of Education. Thanks to both of you, Dave and Carney, for participating in today's webinar and for sharing your knowledge and expertise with our audience today. Now I'd like to turn it over to Dave and Carney.
Thanks, Mark. This is Carney. I'm going to go first. Dave and I divided this up a little bit. Thanks, everyone, for being with us this afternoon. And I'm going to go ahead and take the first slide here. And you already heard Alexandra talk a little bit about what is ability to benefit, but let me just kind of revisit that just a tad with maybe a little more detail here. Ability to benefit is an alternative path to eligibility for federal student aid for students who don't have a high school diploma or its recognized equivalent. I do want to stress that students who qualify under the ability to benefit or ATB provisions are eligible for all Title IV eligible programs, such as, in addition to the Pell Grant program, they would also be eligible for student loans as well. Now, as I said, it's an alternative path, and in order to gain eligibility through ATB, a student has to fulfill one of two requirements. The first is the student has to pass what's known as an independently administered test that's been approved by the U.S. Department of Education. In our list of resources, we provided the list or a link to an electronic announcement that contains the list of the currently approved examinations. And then some questions that we've had coming into us, I wanted to know, how do you get a test approved? The test publisher, the person who's actually responsible for publishing the test, for developing the test, are the ones who submit them to the department for approval. And in their submission, they are basically agreeing to abide by some fairly strict rules about how the examination has to be administered and maintained and validated, all of those great test-taking types of terms. And when it gets to the department, it undergoes a rigorous review by psychometricians and others to make sure it meets the standards before it's considered to be approved by the department. Along with that review, the secretary sets the passing score for that examination. All of the parts of the examination have to be taken at the same time. And also, we talk about independently administered, and what does that mean? Well, we talk about it being we have a definition in our regulations, and it's basically by somebody that has been certified by the test publisher to be able to administer an examination. It can, however, be given at an assessment center at an institution as long as the primary purpose of that assessment center is not the administration of ATB tests. So that's just a little bit more detail about passing an independently administered examination approved by the secretary. The other alternative is that the student has to successfully complete 6 semester or quarter credit hours or 225 clock hours. And those particular credit hours or clock hours have to be applicable to a degree or certificate that's offered by the institution. So by that, I mean they cannot be remedial or developmental. They have to be course credit-bearing credits that would be applicable to a degree or certificate offered by the post-secondary institution. So the ATB alternatives are either one of those. They don't have to meet both, one or the other, in order to establish eligibility through ATB. Another question that we've had a lot about is, well, how long does a student stay an ATB student? How long do they continue to be an ATB student? They remain an ATB student until they have received a high school diploma or its recognized equivalent. So this is both their foot in their door, and this is how they remain until they establish either getting a high school diploma or its recognized equivalent, a GED, passing the HiSET test or the task, or getting an actual high school diploma at the particular state level. I also want to say that, you know, if they do that, then they can enroll in any eligible program. It doesn't have to be an eligible career pathways program, and there are no restrictions on the types or amounts of Title IV aid that they can receive under that. Next slide. A little bit about the history of the ATB provisions. You heard a bit about it before. Basically, up until July 1st, 2012, all students that didn't have a high school diploma or a GED or its recognized equivalent could use the ATB alternative in order to establish eligibility for federal student aid. And then Congress eliminated that option for new students. There are some students that are grandfathered, as you see in the next bullet. There is an exception for students who first enrolled in an eligible post-secondary program prior to that July 1st date. And so they were able to, they're considered grandfathered students, and so they are able to continue under ATB. What happened with the Cromnibus Act was Congress reinstated or put back in ability to benefit for students who were enrolled in an eligible career pathways program. And now I'm going to turn it over to David, who's going to give you more detail on that.
Thanks, Carney. And I would also like to say hello to everyone out there. We're glad to hear of your interest in career pathway programs and the ability to benefit provisions for students. As Carney was saying, when Congress passed its law to permit students to become eligible for Title IV aid through the ATB alternatives, it set a number of new restrictions on the types of programs that students could be enrolled in while receiving aid under those alternatives. So in the law, Congress created a new concept called an eligible career pathway program. And I say new concept strictly in the legal sense. We know that career pathway programs have been out there for quite a while, and there have been a number of them across the nation that have been functioning and serving students for quite some time. And there are a number of laws, both at the federal level, state level, and elsewhere, that may dictate what constitutes a career pathway program. But for the purposes of Title IV aid, federal student aid, an eligible career pathway program has a very specific definition in the law. In the Higher Education Act, an eligible career pathway program has a number of requirements associated with it, and I'm going to go through some of those with you right now. So the first requirement for an eligible career pathway program is that a school must concurrently enroll students in connected adult education and eligible post-secondary programs. So, and I'm actually going to stop right there because that is one of the most important provisions in the eligible career pathway program definition. So we've gotten a number of questions about what it means for students to be concurrently enrolled in an eligible career pathway program. And for our purposes, it means that a student who is in an eligible career pathway program needs to generally be enrolled in both the adult education and the eligible post-secondary program components throughout their enrollment in the eligible career pathway program. We also have had some questions about what we mean by eligible post-secondary programs, and those programs are defined in our regulations in 34 CFR 668.8 and are used routinely by financial aid professionals because we have a number of minimum requirements for number of credit hours or clock hours, a number of weeks, et cetera. But all of those things are exactly the same as all the requirements we've always had for an educational program to be eligible for federal student aid. Another very important question is what is required for adult education as part of this definition, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more on one of the following slides. The other thing I want to mention here is that it's up to a post-secondary institution to ensure that its eligible post-secondary program meets all the requirements of the Higher Education Act, including this important provision that students are concurrently enrolled in adult education and eligible post-secondary programs. So there are a number of other requirements for eligible career pathway programs in the law. An eligible career pathway program must provide students with counseling and support services to identify and attain academic and career goals. It must provide structured course sequences that are articulated and contextualized and allow students to advance to higher levels of education and employment. And it must provide opportunities for acceleration for students to attain recognized post-secondary credentials, including degrees, industry-relevant certifications, and certificates of completion of apprenticeship programs. And we have a few more requirements. An eligible career pathway program must also be organized to meet the needs of adults. It must be aligned with the education and skill needs of the regional economy, and it has to have been developed and implemented in collaboration with partners in business, workforce development, and economic development. So that was a mouthful. I know there's a lot of requirements associated with these programs. And as I mentioned before, when an institution is preparing an eligible career pathway program and it intends to provide Title IV aid to students through one of the ATB alternatives, it needs to be able to document clearly how its eligible career pathway program meets each of these requirements. And that's something that you'd want to retain for as long as you're required to retain documentation of these things for federal student aid purposes. I'll go on to the next slide. So what is adult education? Adult education is a new concept for the Higher Education Act, which primarily deals with post-secondary programs. But for the purposes of the definition of an eligible career pathway program, adult education has the same definition as it does under the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, which is Title II of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Adult education in that act includes academic instruction and education services below the post-secondary level that increase an individual's ability to read, write, and speak in English and perform mathematics or other activities necessary for the attainment of a secondary school diploma or its recognized equivalent. It needs to increase an individual's ability to transition to post-secondary education and training and to obtain employment. One of the questions that we've received about adult education, and this is a very good question, is whether or not it's required for the adult education component of an eligible career pathway program to actually receive funding under Title II of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And the answer to that is no. It's not required that the adult education component actually receive funding under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, but the adult education component does need to meet the requirements in that act, and those are the ones I just mentioned on this slide. And we'll go on to the next slide. The last thing that we want to mention is a little bit about what Carney mentioned before. Students who gain eligibility in an eligible career pathway program under one of the ATB alternatives are eligible for all student aid programs that the institution participates in. So that could include federal work study, could include direct loans, and could include federal Pell Grants. So those are all the programs that any student might be eligible for. However, the second bullet here is important because a student in an eligible career pathway program who enrolled who enrolls for the first time in a post-secondary program on or after July 1st, 2015, is only eligible for a limited Pell Grant award. So it's actually a smaller Pell Grant award than other students would receive. And we published alternative Pell Grant disbursement schedules in a Dear Colleague letter, Gen 1509, that provides the information on how much in Pell Grant funds the students can receive. And if you recall as well, Carney mentioned that students who gain eligibility through the ATB alternatives will continue to be eligible for ATB throughout their enrollment in that program, but they will be subject to the limited Pell Grant amount unless, and this is very important, unless the student receives a high school diploma or its recognized equivalent while they are enrolled at the same institution or elsewhere. As soon as a student has received a high school diploma or its recognized equivalent, that student becomes eligible for a full Pell Grant award, just like any other student would be today. So go on to the next slide. And so we've provided here some resources for you. If you have additional questions or you're interested in more information about the Eligible Career Pathway Program and ATB alternative provisions, the first one is the Dear Colleague letter that I mentioned, Gen 1509, published on May 22nd. That has some broad information about Eligible Career Pathway programs as well as the transition that we're making in the current year. That we also published an electronic announcement that provides some questions and answers for questions that the department has received to give some further clarifications. And the last bullet here is an electronic announcement that describes the approved ability to benefit tests as of today. So this is an important piece of information for schools that are interested in implementing the ATB alternatives because it describes exactly which tests are currently approved and the dates that the tests have been approved for your students to become eligible through the ATB alternatives. And with that, I will turn it back over to Maria.
Great. Well, thank you very much, David and Carney, for that terrific overview and for taking the time to be with us here today. I think you know there are a lot of questions, and I think you guys did a great job of addressing many of them in your remarks. We really appreciate that. So what I want to do next is to really build on what David just discussed around Eligible Career Pathways Program, and just to give everyone a little bit of background on kind of how we got here and a little more from a programmatic perspective about what we mean when we talk about career pathways. And I will say just from a little bit of, I think, the legislative process, I think a large part of why, the field was successful in encouraging Congress to make this restoration is we were able to make a very strong case that career pathways are an evidence-based strategy that really have very positive impact on lower skilled, lower income students and their ability to attain post-secondary credentials. So it really was because of the, a lot of hard work that many of you on this webinar have done over the past decade that has helped to really build the case for where we are today. And as many of you know, there has been a lot of federal and foundation-funded and state-led initiatives, probably over about the past 10 years or so, really focused on career pathways and really their ability to provide increased opportunity for underprepared learners as they really strive to earn post-secondary credentials and to move into family-sustaining careers. And the combinations, listed here on the slide, which is, really similar to what David just discussed, are really the core of that. And we know that from the research that's been conducted by CCRC and the Urban Institute and other entities, that these are really kind of the common elements that really truly do make a difference in student success. So first, really focusing on well-articulated and sequenced coursework ensuring the provision of student supports and college and career guidance, really kind of across the continuum of the pathway. Really looking at how best to contextualize instruction in the context of high-demand occupations, so really making learning relevant to the students. In addition to making it relevant, also accelerating that learning to really help students feel, positive momentum and help them achieve completion faster rather than really kind of getting stuck and spending several semesters in adult basic ed or developmental education. And then finally, as David mentioned, the importance of concurrent enrollment, and in the case of ATD, concurrent enrollment with adult basic education. And just to reiterate, I think the really important point that David made is that when we talk about adult education, we do not necessarily mean only adult basic education programs that are funded through Title II. So it's just, I think that was I learned something there. So I think it was a really important point. And then, some other components that I'll just add to that, again, making sure that the pathway is really organized and developed in a way that meets the needs of adult learners. So that might mean looking at non-semester-based courses, cohort-based training, alternative scheduling models, making sure that the pathways are really truly aligned with the needs of regional economies or regional labor market areas. And that can be done through the use of labor market information, kind of in-depth discussions with regional employers and so on. And then finally, ensuring that the pathways really are both developed, designed and implemented in collaboration with partners such as business, workforce development, and economic development. And just, one thing that comes to mind there is, knowing that the public workforce system at the state level and at the local level are all currently looking at how to fully implement WIOA. So really, I think looking to see how the ability to benefit provisions can be really looked at as one important funding strategy in the WIOA context. So a way to really augment the training dollars that are available through that piece of legislation, I think, is something to look at rather than just looking at them as, kind of parallel efforts. And then, finally, as I mentioned before, there are, a lot of great recent studies, particularly from the Community College Research Center, that really show that students in career pathway programs that include these strategies outperform similar students in earning college credits, earning credentials, and persisting to program completion and good jobs. And in a little while, you'll be hearing from representatives from Washington State, and their IBEST program is really one of the leaders, truly one of the leaders in this work. And their work really forms a lot of the evidence-based, also the Accelerating Opportunity Initiative that JFF has managed in partnership with many states around the country, is also helping to build that evidence-based. And again, I think Congress was very interested in restoring this provision, but with parameters that were going to ensure that funds were, being used in a responsible, appropriate, evidence-based way. So we know that really for the majority of these students who might be underprepared and low income, that Pell Grants are really a critical source of funding, and without this ability to benefit provision, they are not able to participate in these programs. So the partial restoration of ATB was really a huge win for the students that we at JFF really care about. And so students who can really benefit from accelerated pathways to industry-recognized credentials that, again, lead to good jobs. So, I really kind of call on all of you to help get the word out about this opportunity. I'm currently not a Fed, but I was a Fed for 16 years, and I can put that old hat on for a moment and I think, kind of make the statement that, you know, I hope that you really take the opportunity to really implement this in, you know, the fullest extent possible. So I guess, I mean, don't be scared off by it, and I encourage you not to be too cautious. You know, I would really take advantage of it. Clearly, the U.S. Department of Education is really interested in this provision, has taken the time to be here with us today. So I think that's my call to action to all of you, is to, you know, get the word out, really look at how you can take advantage of this provision, because I know I fear, and I know our colleagues at CLASP also fear, that if we don't take this up and really utilize it to the fullest extent possible, that we run the risk of losing this ATB provision once again. So I think the time is now to really, you know, take a stand on this and really make things happen at the state and local level. So with that, I'm going to transition this to Lauren Walliser, who is going to facilitate a conversation with folks from the state and local level. Lauren is a senior policy analyst at CLASP at their Center for Post-Secondary and Economic Success, and she will introduce our state and local speakers who are doing the really important and often hard on-the-ground work.
Thanks so much, Maria. Hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining us this afternoon. As she mentioned, I'm Lauren Walliser. I work at CLASP. For those of you not familiar with CLASP, we are a nonprofit organization that promotes policies to improve the economic security of low-income families and create pathways to education and work. I'd also like to raise some of the points Maria just raised in her presentation, in particular what a critical path ATB is for low-income students and underprepared students. Giving access to this important benefit really is reliant on institutions to be in the driver's seat and take action. We hope that the presenters to come really help those of you who work at institutions. Hopefully they'll raise some questions and barriers and other things that you have and show how they overcame those themselves. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Kerr, who will discuss Washington State's comprehensive IBEST program. John is the Director of Basic Education for Adults at the Washington State Board for Community and Technical Colleges. There he administers several innovative adult training and education programs, effectively serving immigrant and low-income populations and aimed at accelerating their pathways to living wage jobs. John has worked for 23 years in basic education for adults. His current work on the IBEST program has led him to become a champion for accelerated educational pathways and has led him to be active at state and national levels in promoting the initiative and providing trainings. John holds undergraduate and graduate degrees from Central Washington University. So, John?
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Lauren. As Lauren said, I'm John Kerr, the Washington State Director of Basic Education for Adults with the State Board for Community and Technical Colleges. In all of my 40 years as an educator, I've never seen a more critical policy for ending intergenerational poverty and really moving our basic skills adults into living wage careers, like the ability to benefit option for federal Pell Grants. Next slide, please. In Washington, our integrated basic education and skills training, or IBEST programs, puts a basic skills instructor in the same classroom with a career technical or academic transfer instructor to jointly teach both academic skills and workforce skills. This team teaching approach allows students to earn college credits and workforce credentials at the same time as learning those critical basic skills. And this co-enrollment is what creates an accelerated pathway to a living wage job. Students are no longer stuck in years of English language learning and basic skills classes. They're actually earning college credits while preparing for work. Because of our success with IBEST, our IBEST expansion initiatives were developed to create a truly comprehensive pathway and include even our lowest level students in on-ramp programs that enable them to develop the skill level needed to move on to ability to benefit if eligible, and then into our IBEST programming. Our new IBEST comprehensive pathway expansion initiatives provide more access to more adult basic education and English language learners, greatly increasing pathway options and also enrollment. As a result of this intensive focus on on-ramps to IBEST, our new IBEST pathway expansions, and intensive faculty training, we've seen a significant increase in the transition of basic skills students into college-level training and certificate and degree programs. In fact, in 2014, IBEST enrollments increased by 16%, and last year enrollments increased by an additional 9%. And the benefit to students is clear. In the last 2.5 years, IBEST has awarded over 3,995 college-level certificates and degrees to our pre-college adults. The reinstatement of the ability to benefit option to the federal financial aid program for eligible individuals on career pathways has again allowed Washington State to really establish this comprehensive accelerated pathway for our basic skills adults who don't have a high school diploma or its equivalent. And it provides the funding to eligible students to support the completion of certificates and degrees that have meaning in the workforce and to a living wage job. I'd like to take a quick look at what Washington Basic Skills means by a comprehensive pathway. Next slide, please. Washington's guided pathway allows students in our lowest 3 levels, levels 1 through 3, adult basic education, and our English language learners to take on-ramps to IBEST at a $25 per quarter fee as outlined in the first arrow you see there. Our 5 on-ramp options prepare students with the skills to test into or to earn the 6 credits to move on to ability to benefit or traditional financial aid if they're eligible. On-ramp options in our state include a competency-based high school diploma, or what we call High School 21 Plus on-ramp, that awards credit for prior learning and military and work experience and allows eligible students to move on to traditional financial aid once a diploma is earned. We have an IBEST at Work on-ramp, which works with incumbent workers in the workplace, with the teaching team made up of a basic skills instructor and a trainer from that company. An ESL on-ramp, which we call Integrated Digital English Acceleration, that targets our lowest 3 levels of English language learners with 50% of the instruction online. We have on-ramps that are contextualized in employability skills and college readiness, and then career-specific on-ramps that are contextualized to a specific career pathway like healthcare or welding. Then when students are ready, most often at level 4 adult basic education and level 5 English language learning, they can move into the first quarter of IBEST that's described in that second arrow through testing into ability to benefit with tuition funded by our 2 state financial aid options if they're eligible. Our Opportunity Grant and our State Need Grant, which are available to those without a high school diploma or GED. This allows students to earn the 6 credits needed to transition onto ability to benefit and federal financial aid in their second quarter of IBEST. Then beginning in that second quarter of IBEST that you see in the third arrow, they can move on to federal financial aid with ability to benefit if they don't have a high school diploma or GED, and continue to access Opportunity Grant and our State Need Grant funding to get them all the way to a 2-year degree. Upon receiving a 2-year degree in Washington State, they can merely check a box and receive their high school diploma. They then can use those same funding sources, with the exception of Opportunity Grant, to transition into our applied baccalaureate programs or transfer to a four-year university. Ability to benefit is truly a lifeline to a living wage for our eligible basic skills adults, and we're really looking forward to expanding its use and really expanding success for students. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you. That was really informative. Our next presentation is about how Accelerating Opportunity assisted with Kentucky's implementation of ATB. Sharing that with us is Derek Ball, who is a Financial Aid Program Coordinator in the Kentucky Community and Technical College System. Derek has spent his entire career in higher education, previously at a private college, and now for the last 9 years, he's been with the community college system. He spent most of that time on financial aid, but also worked on the TRIO programs. He has a BA in secondary education, an MA in higher education from the University of Kentucky, and an MBA from Morehead State University. Derek?
Thanks, Lauren. I'm going to talk a little bit today about how we partnered with our Accelerating Opportunity programs to deliver the ATB regulations. So to give you a little bit of background, Kentucky Community and Technical College Systems comprised of 16 community technical colleges covering the state of Kentucky, approximate total enrollment of 90,000 students, and we offer a pretty wide variety of degrees, diplomas, and certificates. Next slide, please. So how do we come to implement ATB? Well, as I think Maria mentioned earlier, they have lots of states with accelerating opportunity programs, and so we've had a long history with JFF, going back to their Breaking Through initiative, which is also a partnership with the National Council for Workforce Education, really designed to strengthen the success of community college students, particularly those low-income students. And those programs focused on redesigning college programs and services to assist low-skilled adults, focused on helping them obtain their GED and certificates that will improve their employability. And so their primary strategies were accelerated learning, comprehensive support services, labor market payoffs, and aligning low-skilled adults. So a lot of the same items you see in the current ATB guide. And so in Kentucky, we had several colleges that piloted with this Breaking Through initiative and used that to develop what became our current Accelerating Opportunity program. Next slide, please. So our Accelerating Opportunity program was really intended to create a collaborative career pathway model that prepares students to be both college and career ready. A lot of the core values of Accelerating Opportunity Kentucky are, in-demand workforce credentials, using a collaborative academic model, holistic advising, student-first approach, and comprehensive support services. So some specific requirements to participate with Accelerating Opportunity are aligning career pathways with state and local strategies, meeting labor market needs. Students in AOKY have to be able to earn entry-level certificates. Those need to be embedded in a clear career pathway. They also have to be concurrently enrolled in adult education and the college program. And they all are enrolled in a college and career ready course. At the same time, they're in their adult education courses. The use of acceleration strategies, including contextualized learning, is a required component. And then students also sign a learning contract, so they bear some responsibility for making sure they're doing all the activities they need to. So partnering with our Accelerating Opportunity programs was a natural move for us to ease into the new ATB regulations. So anybody that works with financial aid knows, and Dave alluded to this earlier, we're all about documentation. And so those are the questions I get most often. So next slide, please. We're going to look a little bit at some of the documentation we use just to make sure all of our bases are covered. And so we've adapted this. AOKY had an excellent structure. They were very well built. for recording all kinds of information. So we've started to adapt some of what they used to make sure we capture the appropriate pieces to document our programs. And then most of these sections have additional supporting documents. This is sort of the high-level document we use. So what you see on the slide right here is just an example of one of our programs. A lot of our programs have stackable credentials where students on their way to an associate's degree or a high-level diploma can also earn different certifications. So this is an example of one of our college's programs in welding. And so you can just see, if you read down the slide, we indicate it's a welding program, what the high degrees are, what certificates the students can gain along the way, and then we highlight some specific courses that are part of the program. You know, what specific skills are those students getting? So this particular student would be in a course to either do a combination welder, or if they wanted to go a little bit farther, get an associate degree. But along the way, they're going to pick up 1 or 2 certifications. So they could quickly gain the opportunity for employment, but hopefully would continue to pursue their degree. Next slide. I should mention, too, a core component of our AOKY programs are students completing their GED. So we anticipate a lot of these students, as discussed earlier, switching to become regular students for financial aid purposes at some point during their enrollment. This next section of the application is just sort of an overview, but you can kind of see where we start to indicate, you know, who's participating in determining this as a career pathway. You know, who are the adult education staff? You know, who are the local employer representatives that are indicating, yes, this particular program is going to support our need. You know, we want to document who's coming to the table to say this is a program. Then we offer a space where the college can indicate what they really did to determine who their industry partners were. Did they talk to their local industrial authority? Who did they work with to document that this was a need? Next slide, please. This is just a continuation of that form. Again, we have check boxes for some of what we found to be the more common ways industry partners support this particular pathway. And the pathway does vary by college depending on what really is needed in their local industry. Next slide, please. This section captures some of the labor market information, and so each college does an analysis, and this is one where we would be able to get additional documentation we needed, but this just gives you a high-level view of, you know, what was the labor market data they used, you know, where did they get it from, what's the local sector, and then information about the potential available jobs and salary ranges for this particular pathway. Next slide, please. This is the last section of that, again, talking about supporting wages that this pathway could lead to at the different levels, the outlook for the jobs in this area, and final sign-off on labor market and employer data. Next slide. And then at the end of the application to be considered one of these programs, we just have everybody sign off for their executive team. The AOKY programs have executive teams that sign off. So as we move to expand, go to the next slide, please. So the next step for us, this was an easy model for us to move into because the infrastructure to cover almost all the requirements for ATB were already there. So our discussions now are, you know, we're going to continue to refine the existing model and potentially look at moving that to programs that are not necessarily tied to AOKY. You know, what are those other pathways? If we do that, do we need additional documentation? For example, we may adjust the form to include more signatures. Maybe we need a signature of an academic person at the college. And we want to develop the appropriate framework, support systems, and infrastructure. And so this is, I think, what Sarah is going to actually cover in her session. So with that, I will turn it back over to Lauren.
Thank you so much, Derek. As he mentioned, Sarah is our next presenter. Our final example will discuss the steps St. Paul College in Minnesota is taking to begin their implementation of ATB. Presenting is Sarah Carrico, Dean of Enrollment Management. Sarah has worked in higher education for 13 years in various student services positions. She's currently the Dean of Enrollment Management, as I mentioned, where she leads the college's strategic enrollment management efforts. Her areas of responsibility include admissions, records, registration, and transfer advising. Sarah earned her BA degree at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and her Master of Science in College Student Personnel from University of Maryland, College Park. Sarah?
Thank you, Lauren. I'm speaking from the perspective of a community and technical college campus that does not currently offer what would be considered an eligible career pathway, at least not in its entirety. So I'm going to go over what we see as our next steps in moving forward on developing career pathways that would be eligible for ATB participants. St. Paul College is a member of the Minnesota State College and University System comprised of 31 colleges and universities. When the new ATB provision came out, it led to a lot of questions. Our system vice chancellor of academic and student affairs issued a memo to all campuses outlining a summary of the new ability to benefit provision and what this means for campuses, a definition of an eligible career pathways program, and examples of some current programs that exist in our system today that would qualify as an eligible career pathways program. For us, the most daunting question is where do we start? Our first step is to examine the current partnerships that we have with adult basic education providers and to ask the question, do any of these programs meet the criteria? If so, could participation be expanded to those without a GED or high school diploma? At this point, we don't. So our next step is to meet with our adult basic education partners to discuss our current and future programs. Can any of our current programs be modified or enhanced to qualify for ATB participants, or are we starting from scratch? I know right now no one feels like they're the expert on ATB, so we all need to dive into this together and educate one another on adult basic education, financial aid, et cetera. For us, it's important to work with ABE partners to ensure that they understand how students qualify for ATB and what is required for identified participants to remain eligible for the financial aid. And also that Pell funds through ATB eligibility count towards their federal Pell Grant lifetime eligibility. And we need them to educate us further on adult basic education and terms that have been thrown out during this webinar like Title II and WIOA and things that some of us on the college campuses really aren't familiar with. Next slide. The next step is once we hopefully identify or develop programs that would be open to ATB participants, now what? It's critical to designate a person on your campus who works with these partnerships and discuss these identified programs with financial aid, academic affairs, student affairs. For us, it would be our program advisory boards as well for programs that are identified as possible areas where we could set up these partnerships, because they include, those program advisory boards include our business and industry partnerships with, which, as was mentioned earlier, is also important to the development of this pathway. We also have to ensure that all partners understand the ramifications to institutions if financial aid is erroneously dispersed. I know that this is a daunting concern for many of the financial aid departments on individual campuses. Next, establishing a protocol to notify financial aid and admission staff of ATB eligible students. Developing a process with ABE to ensure that participants continue participation in the adult basic education component of their program to ensure that they remain eligible for that ATB funding, and also developing a process to communicate with ATB students and ensure their continued success in their career pathways program. Some of the forms that Derek from Kentucky showed I think are excellent examples of things that we would eventually need to create too, so we have that documentation and that paperwork to kind of demonstrate first the intent of the pathway and then also to ensure that it's in compliance with the federal financial aid ATB requirements. I think more than anything, what's critical is that this is a group effort. On the college campus, no individual department, such as financial aid or student affairs or academic affairs, can single-handedly make this work. Since it's up to each institution to determine what is deemed an eligible career pathway, that documentation that comes out of lots of discussion is important. Also, I know this was mentioned in one of the previous presenters, but my understanding is that ideally students participating in these programs will ultimately earn their GED or high school equivalency diploma while participating in this program. And I know that to some constituents on campus, that's kind of an important piece for people to understand the value of this program. Lastly, in trying to develop a better understanding of the new ATB provision from someone working on a college campus and doing my own research, I've learned that Career Pathways programs is part of a broader national initiative to create a guided pathways approach intended to improve college completion, particularly when working with low-skilled and or low-income individuals so we can move more trained people into the workforce in family-supporting careers. I found some of this information helpful in piecing together a better understanding of why ATB is important and why this provision can play such a critical role in serving a broader range of low-income individuals. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sarah. We are running 1 minute ahead of schedule, so that means we get 1 extra minute of question and answer time. Thank you to all our presenters. I hope everyone's found your presentations as helpful as I did. To start with, we're going to draw on questions that we received when you first, for those of you who took the survey when you first registered, we're going to pull some of those. So to start with, for a career pathway program to be eligible under ATB, does an institution have to have an adult education component for every course in the program?
Well, this is David Musser. I'll take that one. Well, the answer to that is no. Every course in an eligible career pathway program does not need to include adult education component. Remember that an eligible career pathway program concurrently enrolls students in adult education and an eligible post-secondary program component. So the student has to remain enrolled in the adult education component throughout their time in the eligible career pathway program, but it's not required that every single post-secondary course include some sort of adult education sort of integrated component. That's not a requirement under the statutory definition of an eligible career pathway program.
Great, thank you. And what is the definition of a Title IV eligible post-secondary component?
So as I mentioned in our presentation, a Title IV eligible post-secondary component is how the Department of Education defines an eligible program for purposes of federal student aid eligibility. And so we have specific regulations that are under 34 CFR 668.8. You can also find some information in Volume 2 of the Federal Student Aid Handbook. But an eligible post-secondary program has to lead to a degree or a certificate. It has to meet minimum program length requirements. There's a number of those I won't get into right now. And those are the kinds of things that schools already, most institutions have a handle on through their financial aid offices. Institutions, in many cases, even report some of their non-degree programs to the Department of Education, and we actually let them know whether those programs are eligible or not. As an example, a school could have right now a one-year certificate granting program in accounting. They might also have an adult education branch that strictly offers adult education. Even without having an eligible career pathway program, students with a high school diploma or the equivalent could receive federal student aid for enrollment in that one-year certificate program. But if the institution combined the certificate in accounting with its adult education coursework and made that an eligible career pathway program, then students who enrolled in the accounting program, the certificate program, could become eligible for federal student aid using one of the ATB alternatives. So the important thing with all of this is that the eligible post-secondary program component is just what we call an eligible program and must meet all of the Department of Education's normal requirements for eligible programs.
Thanks, and I think you did hit on another question that people had asked about, does the 16 credit hour, 15-week minimum, that applies to other programs apply to this, and it sounds like the answer is yes.
So that applies to the post-secondary education program component. There's no specific length requirement on the adult education component, except that students have to be concurrently enrolled in adult education throughout the eligible career pathway program.
And we also heard some people ask about the lifetime limit for Pell. Using Pell in an ATB context does count toward their lifetime limit. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Does each eligible career pathway program have to culminate in an associate's degree or an applied sciences degree? I think you also addressed that one just in your last response.
So no, an eligible career pathway program does not have to culminate in a degree. As we mentioned, it could culminate in a certificate. It does need to culminate because it has to include an eligible post-secondary program component. It does have to lead to a recognized credential, but that doesn't necessarily have to be an associate or bachelor's degree. It could be a certificate.
Great. We had a question about the FAFSA, saying there was a question that says, ask a student whether they have a high school diploma or GED, and how should a student respond to that question if they do not have that credential?
So this assumes that the school has an eligible career pathway program. They'd like a student without a high school diploma or the equivalent to be eligible under one of the ATB alternatives. Such a student would indicate none of the above, which is an option for that question when they fill out the FAFSA. And in fact, the school might want them to do that and would want to be sure that the student answers that question accurately, because that would flag for the institution that the student needs to actually fulfill one of the ATB requirements before receiving Title IV aid. So that's a very important question for an institution to check when it's considering whether a student could become eligible for Title IV.
And what about for community colleges who won't enroll a student without a diploma or equivalency in a program of study? Will this change of allowing ATB to allow a student to be official at an institution like that?
This is Carney. We don't dictate an institution's admissions policies. That is up to the institution. If the community college chooses to admit students without a high school diploma or its recognized equivalent and develops an eligible career pathway program, then students in that program may be eligible under one of the ATB alternatives. However, it's up to the school whether or not it wants to admit as regular students without a high school diploma or its recognized equivalent.
This is Sarah from St. Paul College. I would just reiterate that again, what we would do is we would modify our admission policy again. Obviously, if we're going to create some pathways that would be eligible for ATB students, then we would want to make sure that our admissions policy mirrors that. And as Carney said, that's an institutional decision.
Great. We also had a question about can a student be enrolled in more than 6 credit hours and be eligible for ATB? I think they might be confusing the 6 credit hour. Anyway, you all can take the question.
Yeah, this is Carney, and I was going to say they have to successfully complete the 6 credit hours in order to establish eligibility. Once they do that, they're an ATB student, and they certainly can take more than 6 credit hours during a semester. I don't know if that answers their question, but I think you're right. There's a little confusion there. They have to successfully complete the 6 credit hours in order to establish eligibility for Title IV, and only after they've done that can they be eligible for Title IV aid.
I think for something that I've learned in my new experience dealing with WIOA is that the definition of career pathways in WIOA and in the Higher Education Act slightly differ. Is there guidance that you would provide institutions on how to reconcile that if they have an ATB program?
If they want to have an ATB, if they want their students to be able to use ATB to establish eligible for Title IV, they have to use the definition that's in the Higher Education Act.
Great, that's helpful. To circle back to the discussion about the structure of the eligible pathway, we've heard that students must be enrolled in both an adult education component and a Title IV eligible component. Is the pathway itself required to actually integrate those 2 pieces?
So I think this is Dave Musser. I think that's a good question. And the answer in general is yes. The adult education component does need to be integrated with the eligible post-secondary program component. I would recommend, if schools are interested in more information about that particular question, take a look at our questions and answers that we published recently in the resources slide that we provided. But there does need to be a degree of integration between the two things. They can't be entirely separate. For instance, you couldn't just have an adult education program that was operating off to the side that was either optional or had nothing to do with the eligible post-secondary program. There does need to be integration there.
Thanks. We just had a question come in that asks, is there a maximum % or amount of students at an institution that can be ATB students?
There is a limit, and I apologize, I cannot pull it off the top of my head, David. I'm not sure it's 25% or 50% of the institution. The institution cannot admit more than 25%, I think it is, of their students as regular students, individuals who do not have a high school diploma or its recognized equivalent. That's at an institutional level to maintain institutional eligibility. So that is a big deal as far as limits go. But I'm sorry, I don't have my regs right in front of me. I can't remember the exact percentage. Do you remember, David?
Yeah, it's a very narrow provision. So if the institution does not provide a 4-year or 2-year educational program for which it awards a bachelor's degree or an associate's degree, then the institution can't have more than 50% of its regular enrolled students be eligible only on the basis of ATB. That is, at least 50% of their students must have a high school diploma or the recognized equivalent. So that provision is in 34 CFR 600.7. And I would recommend, if an institution is concerned about that, to take a very close look at that provision. But many institutions aren't subject to that requirement because they do offer programs that lead to an associate's degree or bachelor's degree.
That's interesting. That's not something that I knew, so that was helpful for me. Related to developmental education, a student who already has their high school diploma or equivalency can use Pell for developmental education classes. For a student that receives Pell under ATB, is that also the case?
They'd be eligible to use their Title IV money for certain development. There's a limit to the amount of developmental or remedial coursework that we will pay for. I'm not certain, in addition to the adult basic education, how much developmental or remedial coursework the student would also need to take.
Yeah, and this is Dave one more time, and Carney is exactly right, and I would also mention that the important thing is that remedial coursework that directly supports the post-secondary coursework, it can't, for which a student might receive Title IV assistance, that cannot fulfill the definition of adult education. The adult education is a sort of separate activity that's going on, and it's not actually considered remedial coursework.
And piling on with David there, and as I said before, the developmental or remedial coursework cannot be used as any of the 6 credits to establish eligibility under ATB also.
Thank you. I'd actually like to ask our panelists that were in the second half of the webinar a question. I think John touched on it in his presentation, but how are your programs funding the adult education component, or how do you plan to if you don't have a plan yet? What are you thinking about doing?
Hi, this is John Kerr from Washington State. We have an opportunity grant that was established by our legislature that for vocational career technical pathways that are high demand, and they go through a approval process. students are eligible for tuition fees and books up to their first 45 quarter credits, so 1 year of college level, and that funding can be used to pay for those first 6 credits to prove their ability to benefit, and then to move on to ATB.
For St. Paul College, the answer would probably be grants. We currently have a grant-funded program that I think might be able to be revised to accommodate ATB students with some revisions, but that's how because I think the sentiment is probably this is a high-touch program, which costs money, and so for us it would likely be grants would want to be one of the first things we would look at.
This is Derek. For us, since we're currently partnered with Accelerating Opportunity, that's just part of our existing partnership with the state adult ed and those programs. So that's a question that we'll probably discuss as we look to expand.
Thank you. And one more question for you three. We know that the Compass test is going away, but there are other tests available. Do you know what tests you use in your state or at your institution? Do you know, or do you remember any justification for picking that specific test?
The MnSCU system here in Minnesota uses AccuPlacer across the system.
At KCCS previously we had used Compass, and we'll continue to use Compass for low offer placement. We will implement the Wonderlic test strictly for determine ATB eligibility. I don't know the rationale behind that, but that's the test that was selected.
This is John Kerr. In Washington, our colleges are currently looking at that question and looking at what are the multiple ways they might assess that, and so various colleges use different tests, so it's not standard across the state.
Thank you all so much. It's 4:15, so I want to thank all of our fantastic presenters, and especially our colleagues at JFF for all their hard work in organizing this event. After the webinar, we will be sending out some follow-up information, including where to find the slides online, as well as a brief survey. And I'd like to volunteer on behalf of Class B and JFF to feel free to reach out to either of our organizations if you need more information or you continue to face challenges. Thank you all and have a great afternoon.